15 or 20 years ago, at the beginning of every class, I'd hand out a blue book. It was actually a metaphorical blue book. And I told the students, we have two questions, a quiz. I want you to think of the course that you've had in the previous quarter or the previous year that you got the most out of. It could have been 5 years ago, whatever. And then I would say the second question is, write down the key ideas in the course. And I'd give them a couple of minutes. And then I'd call on Tom and say, Tom, how many ideas have you written down? And the almost universal answer was 2. And then it became playful. How much did the course cost? The tuition in the business school is high, not high enough, but it's high. So let's say it was $4,000 for the course. So you put the fraction 4,000 over 2, $2,000 an idea. And then Tom, how many hours were you in class and how long did you study? And Tom would say 100 hours, 100 over 2, 50 hours per idea. And then this came back to haunt me, clever gimmick. And so I felt I had to deliver on ideas. And what I'm going to try to do today is deliver on 2 ideas. 2 ideas. And let me illustrate what they are in advance. The first idea is a brief international monetary history. We have had 4 waves of financial crises in the last 30 years. There's nothing like this earlier in international monetary history. First wave of crises involved Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and 10 or 12 other developing countries in the early 1980s. The second wave of financial crises was in the early 1990s, and it had 2 wings. One was Japan, and the other wing were 3 of the Nordic countries. The third wave of these financial crises is the only one with a proper accepted name, and that's the Asian financial crisis, which begins in July of 1997, although in my writing I put the Mexican crises at the end of 1994 as part of the Asian crisis that came 30 months later because the antecedents were so similar. And the fourth wave of crises is one that we're at the tail end of the fourth wave. I call it the Anglo-Saxon real estate crisis, but that's not fully descriptive. It involves some non-Anglo-Saxon countries, Spain, Greece, Iceland. But it involves the United States, Britain, Ireland, South Africa, Australia, etc. So it's as if there's something in the water supply, the world's water supply, that every 8-9 years a different group of countries more or less exhibit the same symptoms, and most of the banks in these countries fail, need to be rescued by the governments. We're at the tail end of this crisis now in Greece. This weekend or next weekend, Greece will leave the euro, an event that should have happened 2 years ago. So where do these crises come from? Each of these crises was preceded by a credit bubble. Now, what do I mean by a credit bubble? The indebtedness of a group of borrowers increases at a rate of 20 to 30% a year for 3, 4, or more years. For example, the first wave of crises was preceded by a very rapid growth in bank loans to Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, to the governments of these countries and to government-owned firms. And bank lending to these countries continued at a rapid rate for 10 years. The real estate crises in Japan, the real estate and stock market crisis of the early 1990s, was preceded by a very rapid growth in bank loans for real estate. And our own crises, 2007, 2008, crisis of climax in that mid-September weekend when Lehman was allowed to fail. Our own crisis resulted from a surge in real estate prices. I knew there was a credit bubble in the United States in August of 2004. I received an announcement from my credit card company. 0 interest rates on balance transfers for a year. Balance transfer is a euphemism for a loan. There would be a fee of $75 if you activated the balance transfer. So I called MBNA, my credit card company. I wanted to be sure I had read the brochure correctly, and they said I had. And I said, fine, what's my credit line? And they said $100,000, and I said, great. I wire $100,000 to my banker, Tom, at Hagee at LaSalle National Bank, and I went and I sold my 1998 Cessna and bought a new 204 Cessna. This was madness. This was madness. But what was MBNA doing? It was essentially responding to market opportunities. The cost of credit to MBNA was very low, and they figured out that if they baited 1,000 hooks, 990 would be well landed, and at the end of the year they would be able to sock these borrowers with whatever the going interest rate was. So each of these crises is preceded by a very rapid growth of credit. But there's more to it than that. Virtually all of these crises have an international component to them. And let me illustrate that with a very personal experience. In April of 2006, I was going to London, and I called my friend Elroy Dimson, professor at the London Business School, who's taught here many years ago as a visitor. I said, Elroy, take me to lunch. And he said, I'll take you to lunch if you come to my class and tell us what you're doing. I said, fine. There were 2 other visitors in the class that day. One of the other visitors was a graduate of LBS in the class of 205. He was a banker in Reykjavik. And he started talking about market events in Reykjavik. And I had this eerie feeling. I could complete all of his sentences, even though I knew nothing about Iceland. Essentially, he had a set of facts, and I had a model, and I put the 2 of them together. And on that April day, 2006, I left that classroom, and I told myself, go to Iceland the first possible occasion. So my wife and I went to Iceland in June of 2007, the next year. 14 months later, there was a meeting of the Ronald Coase Institute, and I got myself invited on the program. But we drove around Reykjavik, and I counted the cranes, the sort of thing I do in every capital I go to, Japan in the late 1980s. And I visited with 10 or 12 economists in the university, in the central bank, in the private banks, just listening to them describe what was happening. And I became convinced there was a bubble, and I gave a little talk to the people at the Ronald Coase Institute. They were all foreign with one exception, Olaf, professor at the University of Reykjavik. Olaf left the classroom, sold all his stocks, and I am his hero. And then 3 months later, the phone rang, and it was Professor Gísli Svega from the University of Iceland, the Department of Economics, and he invited me to come and give a talk in Iceland. And we had some problems setting the date, but we set the date for early May, and I wrote a very serious paper trying to explain what had happened in Iceland. And I would just like to go over that story. One of my friends, Jeff Schaefer, former Undersecretary of the Treasury when Larry was secretary, Jeff said, Bob, Darwin had to go to the Galapagos to see things that he might have seen in England, but there was too much clutter, and you had to go to Reykjavik to see things that You might have seen in the United States, but there was too much clutter. That's the advantage of small, open economies. So here's what happened in Iceland. There was a surge in the foreign demand for Icelandic krona securities because interest rates were high. And much of this demand initially was from non-residents, Brits, Italians. People were hunting for 50 or 100 more basis points in the interest rate. Before they could buy the Icelandic securities, they first had to buy the Icelandic krona in the currency market. And so when we were there in June of 2007, we'd go out to an ordinary restaurant, and our children would be $250 poorer after we paid the bill. The krona was greatly overvalued. The Icelandic banks owned stocks of the 15 or so Icelandic companies. So when foreigners bought Icelandic stocks, the stock prices went up. And that meant that the capital of the Icelandic banks went up. And what did the banks do? They increased their loans. And some of these loans went to the brothers-in-law of the bankers. And what did they do with the money that they borrowed from the banks? They bought more stocks, which led to an increase in the capital of the Icelandic banks, and they increased their loans. And so what we had was just a perfect bubble, Now, my analysis showed that in 2002, the assets of the Icelandic banks were more or less equal to the country's GDP, its gross national product. By 2008, the assets of the Icelandic banks were 9 times as large as the GDP of Iceland. So the loans of the Icelandic banks, the assets were growing at 60 or 70% a year, and the loans were growing at 60 or 70% only because the capital was growing at 60, 70%, and the capital was growing at 60 or 70% because stock prices were increasing. So the PE ratios for the firms in Iceland were reasonably low given the very rapid rate of growth of their earnings, but they were both increasing together. But the growth in the E in the PE ratio depended on continual increases in stock prices. And if stock prices did not increase in a year, then the E in the PE ratio would essentially be 0, and the PE ratio would be infinitely high. And so it was easy to predict that Iceland would incur a massive financial crisis. My lecture at the university was scheduled for May 5th, 2008. My first meeting in the morning was with the Prime Minister. Some of you may have been reading the last month or so. He was on trial and managed, the verdict was essentially something like irresponsible, but it was not put in the slammer or anything like that. But the problem, he was my first meeting on that morning, and I thought I had a delicate issue, and that is, what do you say to the Prime Minister when you know in your heart of hearts that there is a massive volcano and it is going to explode sometime in the very near future? You try to tell it to him very diplomatically. And 3 months later, Iceland imploded. The currency lost half of its value. And I focus on Iceland only to illustrate that in virtually all of these waves, the inflow of money from abroad led to an increase in the price of the currency in many cases, and it led to an increase in asset prices in all of these cases. And so that's essentially the first point of my 2 points. We have an inherently unstable international financial system. Money sloshes from one country to another, pushes up asset prices, and pushes up currency prices, but the rate of growth of indebtedness is much too rapid to be sustained. And eventually the lenders recognize that the borrower's indebtedness is growing too rapidly. When the lenders dampen the rate at which they will make new loans available to the borrowers often find that they cannot repay. Indeed, when the debt is growing rapidly, let's say at 20% a year, the borrowers are in heaven because they get the cash to pay the interest to the lenders from the lenders in the form of new loans. So let me come down to what I'd call the second idea. Where did the US asset price bubble come from? And the answer is Beijing. And let me tell you this story. The popular story, Gretchen Morgenson in the New York Times, whatever, the popular story in Washington and New York is that the US financial crisis came out of either the incompetence or the greed of the bankers, or the incompetence of the regulators. I'm not going to speak to whether the bankers are competent or incompetent, and whether the regulators are competent or incompetent. But what we have going on is four waves of crises, each of which is preceded by a credit binge. And what we're hunting for is what I would call a generic explanation, not one that fits events in New York City between 2006, 2004, and 2008. So the US credit bubble begins in 2001, and it follows from China's accession to the World Trade Organization. The multinational firms invested very rapidly in China. China's exports increased rapidly. The Chinese then had the choice: should we use the increase in our export earnings to buy more goods from Americans, or should we use the increase in our export earnings to buy more securities? They did both, but they bought a great many more securities. Now, it so happened at the time that the sales personnel from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac went to Beijing and said, you should buy, the Chinese authorities that manage their foreign exchange reserves, you should buy the bonds of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because they pay 40 basis points more than the bonds of the US Treasury, and they're government guaranteed. And it turned out they were government guaranteed. And what did Freddie and Fannie do with the money? They increased the supply of money available for mortgages. And the supply of money available for mortgages increased very rapidly. Why? Where did the subprime crisis came from? It came because there weren't enough prime loans to go around, and so people had to manufacture other credit instruments that were lesser quality. In 1985, I was visiting David Harris, one of my students who I probably taught in this room. David was a banker with Citibank in Rio. We had been drinking, we went into his office, and back at his desk there was this credenza, and it had 40 or 50 tombstones, advertisements of the underwritings that Citibank had taken the lead in. And David picked up one and he said, this one will earn 7%, this will earn 6%, this will earn 5%, et cetera, et cetera. You get the drift of the story. This one will earn -2. And essentially what happens during every credit binge is that the quality of credit declines. Less credit-worthy borrowers get credit. People who would not have been able to obtain credit if the growth of credit had been slower. And then when the accident occurs, these borrowers do not have the funds to repay, and the system collapses. And that's exactly what happened in the United States. We had a growth of foreign demand for US dollar securities between 2002 and 2008. In some countries, The Chinese currency was pegged to the US dollar, other currencies were not. US asset prices increased, they increased at a non-sustainable rate, and it was predictable, and it was predicted by some of us, that this bubble was going to collapse, and it did. So we have a very unstable international financial system, and we have a great intellectual hole in that the regulatory authorities do not understand that the source of these crises is the cross-border flows of money. So let me conclude with the two ideas. The first idea is that each of these waves of financial crises has followed from a credit binge, and virtually all of these credit binges have had a very important international component. The international component of cross-border money flows lead to an increase in the price of the currency and an increase of asset prices. And the second key idea is that the source of the US financial crises was the credit binge in the housing market, and that credit binge resulted from a surge in the US payments deficit and a sharp increase in the Chinese demand for the IOUs of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.